Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of Superhero Pantheon. My name is Jerome Cuson, and we are doing something a little bit different this week because we have already recorded a review of X-Men Origins Wolverine. So we are going to replay that episode that we recorded in May of last year. It was a part of Ryan Reynolds month, but since our regular episode this week is going to be about its sequel to Wolverine, I thought it was only fitting that we attach this episode that was on the Pro Wrestling Ponderings feed last year onto this episode so that you can be all caught up on your X-Men movies before you go see Dark Phoenix in a few weeks. So first you are going to hear our review from last year about X-Men Origins Wolverine, and then we will go into our regular episode as we discuss the Wolverine. So without any further ado, let's get to our review of X-Men Origins.
From the studio that nearly destroyed the X-Men franchise with The Last Stand comes the film that destroyed your favorite X-Men, Wolverine. Journey to 1970s Canada, where everyone dresses like it's 2009 and no one has a Canadian accent.
Guys, whatever this is, take it outside.
Witness Marvel's most hardcore character get completely neutered in his own extremely boring movie.
My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. Fittingly, he can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, a few weeks ago, I was really mulling over the fact that I was a little MCU'd out, a little bit tired of the MCU formula. But after watching the movies that we have watched, Brian, I have to tell you, I just want to roll up in the MCU blanket that has Iron Man and the Hulk and Captain America. I just want to snuggle up to it real tight, because we are not reviewing the best superhero movies of all time right now.
No, and yeah, it's kind of what can you say? You kind of have to appreciate the MCU for what they've done in comparison to the past movies from before, like these. I mean, yeah, the Green Lantern. I mean, we're gonna review Green Lantern too, but we watched them back to back with the Origins, man, and it's just like, thank God we got the MCU, you know what I mean? Thank God they care about continuity and story and character development and all kinds of shit that we really need to pay off of these characters. And yeah, this does not hold up, man. This movie's terrible. We're talking about Origins. It's bad, but bland at the same time. But I say Green Lantern's worse, but whatever. It was tough to sit through, man. But you know, there was that one good scene we'll talk about in a bit in the farm. But then it's this full circle thing with Wolverine and farms, man. Does not mix well.
What is up with superhero movies and superhero adjacent movies going to farms? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Avengers: Age of Ultron. This happens in two different Wolverine movies. This one, and then we're going to talk about another one whenever we talk about Logan. There's just something about farms, man.
I've been thinking about that. I think that's got to do with the Superman movie. And I think everyone just wants to create that iconic kind of feel that the Fields had, and the way Mama Kent was embracing her son, blah, blah, blah. And they try to recreate those moments on the farm because it's, you know, it's Americana, it's, you know, it's peaceful, it's quaint, and then all of a sudden there's a bullet in your chest.
Let's get into this, as it is funny to think about the fact that in the last few years, Marvel controls the beginning of the summer. It is a tradition that in the first week of May or the last week of April, that an MCU movie is going to kick off the summer, whether it is an Avengers movie, whether it's Guardians of the Galaxy, or anything else. But in the summer of 2009, the movie that kicked off the summer was Wolverine X-Men Origins. What a way to kick off the summer of 2009. This, of course, coming just 1 year after Iron Man, 1 year after The Dark Knight. 2009... kicking off with this is kind of like a kick to the nuts, if you ask me.
I barely remember any movies from 2009, to be honest. It seems like a dry period after Dark Knight and Iron Man, right? I mean, other than this movie, I can't think of any other movie that came out in 2009 right now. 2010, yeah, because I think 2010 was Iron Man 2 and Inception and, you know, but other than that, I can't think of anything from 2009 right now.
Right. It was very forgettable. And this movie has a rather infamous reputation because a near-finished cut of this movie was released onto torrent sites a week before the premiere. I believe, as I was reading, some of this even popped up a month or so beforehand, which is pretty amazing. And I can't even imagine how Disney would react if an Avengers movie got onto the torrent sites beforehand. But because of that, allegedly, that is why the box office for this movie was not great. The budget was $150 million. It made $179 million domestically, and it grossed almost $400 million worldwide. Basically, it broke even, or it made a little bit of money. That's the theory that is behind that, even though it did make almost $400 million worldwide. This was not regarded as a success either critically or financially because of the reasons that were just stated. Gavin Hood, who is the director of this movie, has only directed one movie since that, and that is Ender's Game, also pretty mediocre as well. Here's a fun fact for you, Brian. David Benioff, who is the showrunner of Game of Thrones, is one of the co-writers, and you will be shocked to know that he wanted a darker and more brutal story and wrote his first script with an R rating in mind. Producer Hugh Jackman did not see the need for an R rating, and the script was toned down to a safer PG-13 level, and that is where I believe the problems start.
Oh, what do you know? It takes an R rating to make the perfect Wolverine movie, and we didn't figure it out until 8 years later, I guess. But yeah, I mean, Game of Thrones, you can kind of see some of that. I mean, I can kind of see some of those elements. It is a darker kind of movie in comparison to the others, I think, and it's very violent, not too violent, but at the same time, I can definitely see why the R rating was pushed, because we know why it was pushed, because that's what essentially a good Logan movie is he's got to be unfiltered, he's got to be raw, he's got to be the animal, not Batista. But yeah, you can see where the formula works, and he had the right idea.
Wolverine also does not play well as the lead of a movie or a TV show. I think that this is something that in media consistently gets wrong. This is not who Wolverine is. It's never worked out. He is the side character. He is more of an anti-hero than a lot of the other characters in the X-Men and a lot of the other Marvel superheroes. And that's one of the reasons that I don't think Wolverine plays all that well in his own movie. He cannot carry a movie. Logan was done in a very specific way where he could exhibit some of those animal characteristics. But even that movie, you still had Xavier, you still had X-23, you still had other people that he could play off of. And this movie just does not have that. This movie has a lot of characters in it, and none of them are going to stick with you. Including, of course, Ryan Reynolds playing Deadpool. And I know what you're thinking. Wolverine and Deadpool, that's got to be a really cool idea. So in the spirit of this being Ryan Reynolds month, let's talk about Deadpool. Originally, there was a Deadpool movie had been in the works. Our favorite comic book affiliated director and writer, David S. Goyer, was scheduled to direct and have Ryan Reynolds as the star. Reynolds himself had always dreamt of playing Deadpool, and when he heard Deadpool was given a place in the script, he immediately approached the filmmakers for the role. He wanted to be in this movie, Brian, and how did they treat him?
Like a joke? Because he wouldn't shut up, and then at the end of the movie, they just forced him to shut up. It's not the Deadpool that we know and love, for sure. It's just an annoying Ryan Reynolds role.
They had Ryan Reynolds doing action sequences and not really talking. He plays a big role at the end of this movie as he is battling both Wolverine and Sabretooth. Because of the machinations of the plot, he is able to acquire other mutant powers. So we see him using the optic blasts of Cyclops. We see him transferring himself, disappearing and reappearing in other places. This was a very disappointing use of Deadpool for a lot of reasons. Deadpool, of course, is known for his sarcastic commentary, breaking of the fourth wall, and just generally being a much lighter character than what is seen here. Other than the two action sequences, Ryan Reynolds barely plays a factor, and there is no greater representation of why this movie sucks than the fact that Ryan Reynolds literally has his mouth covered and sewn together so that he cannot talk. That symbolizes this movie perfectly.
And I hated the pun for Deadpool in this movie, because in Deadpool, in the most recent one, the pun was they had that board, right? And then it was this pool of, who's dead or whatever. And we did the Deadpool for Avengers, right? Here, he's Deadpool because they got a pool of all the dead mutants' DNA and put it into him. Lame. Not nearly as fun. I just hate the concept of him stealing everyone's powers even though he's dead, and he's this ultimate hero, or not hero, but he's this ultimate mutant, and then he just gets his head chopped off. Kind of lame.
Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool and Wesley Snipes in the Blade movies, these are the only two actors with roles in Marvel Comics film adaptations to have never gone through an audition. Ryan Reynolds, as we will talk about next week extensively, is Deadpool. That's what he is. He is a sarcastic asshole, and that, as we will be discussing later with Green Lantern, this is basically the role that he is born to play.
Yeah, and we'll talk about it when we talk about Deadpool, but it's obvious that he's one-dimensional. He's not that good of an actor. Van Wilder, that's pretty much Deadpool too, right? Like, it's a young Deadpool before he goes off to kill people as an assassin or whatever. But the thing is, it's just like, he's one-dimensional, and that one dimension he needs to stick to because it's Deadpool, and that's where the money is for him. And if he tries anything else, he's just being Ryan Reynolds, the asshole actor that we know.
Hugh Jackman expressed disappointment over the final product, admitting it fell short of expectations and really did not do the character justice. He and the rest of the crew, they really wanted to do a better job with The Wolverine, which came out 4 years later, and a movie that we will be discussing at some point in the next few months. But even Hugh Jackman understood what a piece of shit this was.
Piece of shit's a hard word. I mean, it's bad, but I would say piece of shit is more in the terms of like Catwoman and like Blade Trinity probably. This is just bland at times. Like, it tries, but then it's just bland. It's like Hugh Jackman wanted it in one direction, Gavin Hood wanted it in another direction, and obviously the writers had a different direction in mind, and we get all these three directions at once, and it's so off, and there's no focus, and it doesn't hold up, man. It doesn't hold together well. It's a script, the continuity's off. It's just off. Everything is off, and I can see why Hugh Jackman kind of like, shits on this movie. It's just too many cooks in the kitchen, I think.
It's funny you mentioned that, too many cooks in the kitchen. This is how Gavin Hood described the film's central theme as Wolverine's inner struggle between his animalistic and human qualities. What he said is, quote, "I realize that Wolverine's great appeal lies in the fact that he's someone who in some ways is filled with a great deal of self-loathing by his own nature, and he's constantly at war with himself." I think we really see that in a much better way done in the next two Wolverine movies. We really don't see a lot of that conflict here. There are times when it's trying to be a very humorous and jokey film. Examples, see the scene with Wolverine battling the Blob. But then there are also these very serious moments when Sabretooth is literally breaking the spine of another character, or the ending scene with Deadpool and when Wolverine gets shot with the two adamantium bullets and he doesn't even realize who Silver Fox is, even though she's dead. This movie is highly problematic and tends to skip around a lot, and the plot of this movie is incomprehensible to me. I could not tell you what the plot of this movie is as a through line.
Yeah, there's no, like, as they call it in the business, a log line or whatever it's called, as I used to call it back in the day when I was in college, but it's hard to describe this movie in one sentence, which you should be able to do for any good movie or any movie at all. And the best way I can describe it is Wolverine wants revenge on his fake dead wife, but finds out that he has to kill Deadpool instead. Did I hit all the points? Like, that's basically this movie.
Well, originally Wolverine was part of a pseudo-military force that he eventually decides to leave at random, and then 6 years later, it basically all comes back. We get William Stryker in this movie, played by Danny Huston, and I think the best way to describe and the most gentle way of describing William Stryker in this movie is the ultimate generic villain. He literally is only there to turn the plot, and he really doesn't have much of a purpose. And that's what happens when you cast someone like Danny Huston in this role and not somebody with more panache and who's a little bit more famous. I mean, this is what happens. He's doing the best he can, but just like when he played Ludendorff in Wonder Woman, all he is literally doing here is playing a generic evil general.
Yeah, and that was a red herring in that movie. But, he comes from an acting family, right? He comes from the Houston acting family or whatever, as I recall. Am I right on that?
Yes, he does, but...
So, it doesn't hold the cachet it did in the 70s, right? I get that, and I know what you're saying, and not only that, but just like, okay, this is kind of like it ties in with the Han Solo thing that I'm pissed off about. Brian Cox is much shorter than Danny Huston. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not keeping track of the height of the actor.
But the thing is like it's so clear that these guys do not look like the same person, and that really bugs me. The continuity of this movie, man, is just so fucking bad. But and then Han Solo, like he's 3 foot shorter than Harrison Ford, man. I just
3 inches is nothing. That is something that you could shoot around.
well, it's build height, so that could be 6 inches for all we know. But it was clear that this guy looks nothing like Brian Cox from X-Men 2, and that just really bothered me. And I'm just like, these seem like two different people. Like, didn't that feel like the same way for you? I know that Brian Cox is much older in X-Men 2, but God, it just seemed like two. God, it just seemed like two.
Brian Cox is actually a good actor. I think that's where the problem starts. And I think one of the other issues. I mean, this movie has so many timeline issues. Let's get into some of those right now. Emma Frost is in this movie as the sister of Silver Fox, and when we see her, she looks nothing like January Jones or an older January Jones. Even though this movie is supposed to take place in the year 1979, she's basically a teenager in this movie, and then she exhibits some powers, and we don't know what happens to her after. We also get Xavier walking in this movie, even though it was established in X-Men First Class that Xavier was basically in a wheelchair by the end of that movie. We had Cyclops in this movie for some reason. I guess they had to have an X-Men connection of some sort in there. This movie is a continuity mess, and the de-aging on Xavier looks also atrocious in this movie.
Yeah, 2009 special effects that we're kind of half-assed in that one. Also, what really irritated me is Liev Schreiber, man, looks nothing like Tyler Mane. Nothing. And not even like they didn't even bother to make the prosthetic or the makeup and the prosthetics look the same as the same dude from the X-Men movie from the first movie. It's just so like lazy to me. Like, why are you making these the same characters but completely different, and then trying to like tie everything together, but it doesn't tie in together, and then they wasted Gambit, man. They wasted fucking Gambit completely. He was on the island the whole time. He comes out of a fucking room from the bottom of the island to show up at the end after Wolverine does all the work.
They waste Gambit. They waste the Blob as well. The Blob is treated like a chump in this movie as well. We cannot forget that. Basically no character is given even a modicum of respect, and I would argue the same is true for Wolverine. Those scenes with Silver Fox were so bland and boring and just really hard to watch. I mean, this movie is much shorter than the average Marvel film, and it kind of felt like a chore to watch. You fell asleep halfway through, which is completely understandable, and I definitely had to take 2 sittings to watch this, and I think that about says it all for this.
Yeah, I fell asleep around the part of Gambit, and then woke up this morning, and then I was just like, yeah, that kind of says the whole thing about the movie. I think if it was better engaging, and if I was watching Avengers at the same time, I probably would have stayed awake for the Avengers. But yeah, it sucks, man, because Gambit, I think, is a really cool character, and he looks nothing like the Gambit that I know, and I know they try to separate the comic book cartoon look from the movie look, but he didn't look distinctive at all. He just looked like a dude with a set of cards, and he just kept getting in the way, it seemed, and he really was just like, man, we need a reason to throw in Gambit. Oh, he came off the island, and he'll show Wolverine the way. And then just kind of like, yeah, that's it.
At first, it seemed like he was set up to be kind of a villain character. He did that one really cool sequence with the cards, but then he literally disappears and comes back at the end and is seemingly a hero? His motivations were very, very unclear to me.
He wasn't even necessary for this movie. They just threw him in. Ugh.
Obviously, Brian is completely disgusted, but I have to be honest with you and just say, if this movie had been the opening credits sequence, which was Wolverine and Sabretooth fighting through a number of American wars, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, I think that would have been a great first movie for Wolverine and Sabretooth to establish their relationship and to establish just how long Wolverine has lived and existed. And there are so many things that they could have done with that, with them fighting in the different wars. Quite honestly, they did a better job of exploring Wolverine's role in the wars in the second movie at the beginning of that than they did in this movie, where they basically just glossed over it in about 5 minutes. I want to see the Wolverine Sabretooth fight in different American wars, not only because it would be cool, but also because they're Canadian, and I want to see how that works.
God, I was thinking the same thing. I didn't think about the Canadian part, but I thought the same thing, man. Talk about same wavelength. Like that was the most interesting part of the movie, was the opening credits of them in the different wars. Because that's a story, man. I was like, why are you glossing over this? I don't want to see like this shit. Like I'm used to seeing this shit about the X-Men where it's like the government's involved and they want to take their power. I want to see them in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, what side of the Civil War they were on, World War One, World War Two. Yeah, you meant like you hit it on the nail on the head, man. I was thinking the same thing last night, and then I was even thinking like you do Wolverine, the Wolverine, but you do it in World War Two Japan.
I mean, I certainly think that there's a lot of different ideas that you could go, and many of them would be better than what they came up with here, because this feels like every X-Men plot. I think even Logan does this to an extent. I think they do it in a much better way. But so many of these movies are about stealing mutants, kidnapping mutants, or stealing their powers, and I think that has been a very lazy trope. That when we start discussing more of the X-Men films, we're going to get into this pretty deeply. But this movie undoubtedly does it the absolute worst, because this movie it doesn't function from a plot standpoint. Wolverine's claws look really bad. They looked pretty decent in the first three X-Men movies, but they really look bad here.
They look like bad CGI, man. Like really, I noticed that too in the bathroom scene.
Can we talk about the bathroom scene for a minute and how bad it was and how it just made Wolverine look like a complete goofball?
It just made him look like a klutz for some reason. I don't get that. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, dude, he just destroyed their plumbing and just walked in the kitchen like, sorry, dude. Like, I mean, it was awful. Other than, like, it was a cool scene, like, when he's talking to the old dude in the barn. Like, that's, like, another cool scene that I like in this movie. Like, one of the few is them in the barn, and then, if you kind of think about it, ties in with the other stuff that happens to Logan in the barn and Logan. Just Barnes and Logan don't mix, because if you see Logan coming to your barn, and you're probably going to die. And he's not going to kill you. It's the people after him that are going to kill you.
Funny how that works. Let's get to the burning questions here, because honestly, I am really struggling to talk about this movie.
We pretty much hit everything we could hit on. I mean, it sucks. It was poorly written, poorly put together. They wasted the characters. The plot sucks. Ryan Reynolds was totally misused. Yeah, I mean, what can you say? They fucked up everything about this movie, and it just comes off bland. But Green Lantern is worse.
We'll get to that in just a few minutes. What's up with Hugh Jackman's hair in this movie? I know that's a really random thing, but, you know, when you're watching a bland movie and you really just start noticing everything, I was really focused on his hair, and it just bothered me for some reason. It didn't look like the Wolverine haircut that we've all been used to, and it really bothered me, and I can't explain why.
Man, talk about same wavelength again. I was just distracted, but in a good way. I was like, what is he doing with his conditioner? Is it some kind of like something he's using? That dude's got awesome hair, man. It was so immaculate and perfect.
It didn't work for the character, though. Like, I admire the haircut, but for Wolverine, it doesn't work.
I mean, give credit where credit's due. It looked good, but I see what you're saying. He's supposed to be an animalistic, kind of scruffy looking, and he's got this nice mane of hair. And not only that, it's like the same hair for like 200 years. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah, and then he changes it in the last 20 to look more like a Wolverine?
Sure.
I guess because he lost his memory, maybe?
And then notice when he was naked in the barn, too, it was still like perfect hair. Like he was still able to get conditioner even after escaping that tank covered in water. Great job.
More about Hugh Jackman. Is this the worst Hugh Jackman Wolverine performance? I say yes, because he was very low energy through most of it, and then there were points when he just did a lot of screaming, particularly when he got to the adamantium. On a side note, I have a list of things that I never want to see again in a superhero movie. I never want to see Uncle Ben get shot in a Spider-Man movie and utter the phrase, "with great power comes great responsibility." I never want to see Batman's parents get murdered on the screen. And I don't want to see Wolverine get his adamantium anymore, because I've seen it like 3 or 4 times, and I don't need to see it anymore.
Yeah, I agree. Once Disney will do it, I think they're just going to kind of gloss over it and kind of just be like, yeah, he's the Wolverine, he's got this history, but he's with the X-Men now, and that's what people really care about. So Oh yeah, I forgot about that part. Yeah, clearly. I would even say Wolverine. He's a lot better. X-Men 3 tries more. So, like I said, the script and the direction are just off in this, and that's why I think he's just lost in this movie.
How depressing is that in the 20 years of X-Men, this is the only version of Gambit there's been.
It just shows me that I don't think the producers at Fox kind of get what the people want from X-Men, and they have this like certain idea of what the people want, and it doesn't match up with what we actually want. Because if we got the X-Men movies that we wanted, they'd be bright, colorful, they'd be like Guardians, you know what I mean? Like bright colors, and that's what the show is. And I've had that rant before in the first X-Men podcast, but it's clear that even with this Gambit thing, man, they just don't know what the fans want. And had they known what we really want, we would have got the badass Gambit that we've been wanting for years, and not that bland dude that we got. And I guess he's got a gambling problem. So
Instead, we get Wolverine in every goddamn movie, and it's just annoying. We don't need Wolverine in every movie. Yes, he is a popular character, but we don't. And I think X-Men First Class proved that you do not need Wolverine in an X-Men movie to have it be successful. Because, and I don't think this is this may be in relationship to what you're saying, Brian, but that's the one movie where they wear their brightly colored costumes. Even though it's kind of a dark movie, they do wear their brightly colored costumes.
yeah, I was actually alluding to that too. Talk about same wavelength, man. But yeah, and even that I was about to say, like, that's the one movie where Wolverine's like not really in it, and it's awesome. Days of Futures Past is on that, almost on that level too, but I think First Class is the best X-Men movie, other than, I mean, I guess Logan, if you quantify it as an X-Men movie, which I think we do, but it's that and First Class is the top two, and yeah, I think it's on that second tier now because I think Logan kind of overtook that, and I thought First Class is like a step above. So
Interesting. We'll have to come back to this. Why does the X-Men franchise hate black people?
I don't know, man. Especially since it's kind of like this allegory for the civil rights movement back in the day. I don't know. I think we're gonna get some changes once we get the X-Men franchise over at Disney, and I think we get Storm as like a central figure more, and I think we get, you know what I mean, like what we kind of want out of the X-Men, like I've been saying. And we're going to get some changes. I think Storm as a focus is going to be a way to go, because if they can tie in T'Challa and Storm marrying in 5 years, I'm going to lose my shit.
The reason that we are, of course, talking about this question is that Storm obviously is a character that has not been emphasized that much in any of the X-Men movies, even though she is an integral part of the team. There have also been a number of X-Men movies, including First Class and this movie, where minority characters are punked out very quickly. In this case, Will.i.am is playing basically a Nightcrawler ripoff, where he's able to teleport from place to place, and he exists merely to push Wolverine into getting to the final battle when he goes with Gambit, and he literally has his spine ripped out from him, courtesy of Liev Schreiber's Sabretooth. That is why we are talking about this question, and it's something we're going to come back to when we talk about First Class. But Will.i.am is in this movie, and like so many others, basically serves no purpose.
Definitely. And he's a good voice actor, too. Good for him, because I completely forgot he was in this movie, and I was like, oh, yeah, Black Eyed Peas was pretty big around that time. And then I looked into it, and I was like, oh, yeah, he was the voice in Madagascar 2 and Rio, and I've seen those movies, and he's a good voice actor, so credit to him.
And finally, as we are going to be discussing this with Green Lantern, we're going to ask the same question. Why didn't Ryan Reynolds work in this movie?
I don't know, man. Like, Deadpool and Wolverine in the same movie is going to be tough to sell. I know they want it, but in the beginning, it just doesn't click. And I think it's, like I said, he's just a terrible actor. And unless he's playing, like, the Deadpool that we know, it just comes off as bad and like he's an asshole. And, I mean, you shut him up. You shut him up at the end of the movie, just as like a way to just like saying like, yeah, we know the Deadpool that you know and love from the comics, so we're just gonna shut him up just to fuck with you. It was fucking terrible. They didn't know what to do with him, and Ryan Reynolds got stuck in it because he just kind of jumped in wanting to play Deadpool, not reading the script, it seems like.
All right, let's get to our scores. First of all, the heroes. I am giving this a 6. Wolverine is, of course, always a decent hero. Gets a couple of decent moments, but he seems pretty bored throughout. Will.i.am is punked out. Silver Fox gets nothing to do. I don't even know what to classify Gambit. If you notice, we haven't talked about Silver Fox, and there's a good reason for that. She is She kind of looks like Rebecca Hall and Olivia Munn, the actress who plays Silver Fox, and she is merely there as a love interest, and that's it.
Yeah, complete waste. And I didn't. I was fake loving you, and then by the end, I really loved you, and yeah, just
That's a trope that
complete.
also needs to die.
Yeah, completely. Needs to die. Yeah.
What's your hero score?
4 because I mean they didn't really do anything heroic, man. It was just, as the Striker said, it's just the people in the men in your family tend to respond to revenge a lot more, and it was just fake revenge that led to him saving mutants on an island. I don't know. It's a 4 because he's just acting out of self-revenge the whole time, and then he stumbles upon this island with a bunch of mutants. It's like, oh, I'll free him.
My villain score, I'm actually lowering this because of our conversation. I'm going to lower this down to a 4. Danny Houston is the definition of generic. What is up with Liev Schreiber's accent in this movie? That is, and it's one of those things where when a movie is bad, things just kind of start to pile up, and things that maybe you wouldn't notice or you wouldn't think are bad, they just really start to pile up, and Liev Schreiber is something else that you could just throw on the pile, because he's from Canada, but he has like this weird, like, fake New York accent that I just don't buy at all.
I had no problem with the accent. I gave it a. Let me see. I was gonna give it a 6, but I guess I'm gonna give it a 5 now that I think about it, because he wasn't even like the villain, and they set him up as like this murderer, like serial murderer, and he's not even like the guy who. I mean, he didn't even kill the girl. I don't know. And then Stryker's like the bad guy the whole time, and we knew that, but it's a mess, even with the villains, man, and it's not really effective at all. So yeah, I'm going with a 5.
The story, I am giving this a 3 because this movie is all over the place. It is not cohesive. All the characters are completely wasted. This movie fails on the script level and never really recovers.
Same score, same reason, and God, the continuity, like we said, just infuriates me with the Sabretooth look, Xavier standing, all that stuff. It's just, it sucks.
The visuals, I gave this a 5. Nothing all that interesting. The special effects sometimes look incomplete, even within the final version of this movie. Remember when Wolverine was destroying the ladder and how bad that looked?
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
It looked like video game.
Yeah, I'll give it a 6 just because the stuff with the Gambit special effects were kind of cool. That's kind of what I picture a Gambit to be. Everything else doesn't really hold up over time. CGI doesn't really look good. We mentioned the claws. Just CGI claws in this movie were fucking terrible.
And finally, The Legacy, I gave this a 3. This movie is completely ignored in continuity by all other X-Men movies. I don't think even the Wolverine acknowledges what happened in this movie. Deadpool makes fun of this, and it is generally regarded as the worst X-Men movie, even over The Last Stand, which is unbelievable, because I don't think The Last Stand is very good either, but this is not good.
2 for me. It's just so... It almost tarnished the legacy to the point where they had to go back in time and choose a completely set of producers and direct, or maybe not producers, but getting Matthew Vaughn to set the correction course was the smart move for this. And people completely never want to watch this movie again, and probably does terrible ratings on TV.
Absolutely. My total score is 10 plus 3 is 13. 21 is my score.
Okay, so I got 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 20.
So the total score is a 41, which means it is not even close to either the Hall of Fame or really the Pile of Shame. I think about a 4 out of 10, which is if you what it would average out to. I think that's about right for this. I don't think this is Pile of Shame worthy, but I certainly think this is a movie that should be avoided at all cost.
It's not even worth watching once if you've never seen it. Like, normally we'd say, oh, go check it out. It's worth a rental. If you've never seen it, never watch it, because it's really not going to do you any good at all. It's going to get you frustrated, especially if you're an X-Men fan. I guess if you're a kid and you're renting this movie, you're just going to get confused, because it doesn't hold up to any of the continuity of the X-Men movies prior. So,
James Mangold directed an introspective movie about Wolverine, considering his own mortality, and it wasn't called Logan. First, there was The Wolverine.
For over a year. It's an honor to meet the Wolverine.
That's not who I am anymore. For many years, I have wanted to thank you for saving my life. But I didn't send for you only to thank you, Logan. I wanted to repay you. A gift to equal the life you gave me. You have struggled long enough. I can end your eternity. Make you mortal.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the Pile of Shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5-star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at HeroPantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, I just want to point out that Mike and Matt, when they did their podcast on the Wolverine, which you can also find on Enter the Real World, they called this movie boring. And I conferred with Matt Waters to confirm that that indeed was still his opinion. And I think that that is what many people think of this movie. It is almost forgotten. I think the post-credit sequence in a lot of ways is the thing that people associate with this movie. But maybe it is because the glow of Logan is so great that it has retroactively made this movie better. But I am here to tell you, I am here to stand for Wolverine.
Me too. And I didn't watch this movie since it came out in theaters, and I thought maybe I should have watched this maybe on DVD well after the fact. But looking back and seeing it for this is actually the second time I watched this movie, and it really compliments Logan well. Like if you watch this movie now, with that lens of like a Logan kind of like looking back with the lens of Logan, it really complements it, and like it really sets it up with all the specific shots and the music. At times I felt like, am I watching Logan right now? Because it felt like it, you know what I mean? And they were just kind of setting up and getting to that, but the concepts and like the style and some of the morality issues he's going through with Wolverine in this movie, very well done, I thought. The only thing, of course, that kind of falls apart is the third act and the villains, but we'll get to that. But you know, the first 2/3 of this movie I thought were really well done, and I thought the cinematography was really well done, and it had that Western feel that I thought that this movie was going to have and it did have, and mixed with that little, you know, samurai kind of Shogun thing going on, the Ronin thing going on, it really fit the theme of Wolverine, and I kind of wish they saved Lady Deathstrike for this, but unfortunately they kind of went out of order and they couldn't do it anymore, but they kind of played with a little bit of his history in Japan, and the first 5 minutes are unbelievable and still really stick out to me a lot because it's very shocking to watch and eye-opening and kind of, you know, makes the horrors of war really in your face when you see Wolverine get literally like obliterated and then have to regrow himself back in like 30 seconds.
One of the things that we talked about in our X-Men Origins Wolverine review was this idea that the most interesting aspect of that movie was Wolverine and Sabretooth fighting in different wars, right? So we actually get a little bit of that in these 5 minutes, and granted, it's not the entire movie, but it at least does set up a very interesting premise of Wolverine saving the soldier, able to do so because of his healing power, and then this kind of comes back about 75 years later to where this person is dying and wants to live forever, so to speak, and he can do that if he is able to take Logan's powers. So Hugh Jackman wanted to be as ripped in his cut as possible, and he adopted a dehydration diet, where he did not consume any liquid for 36 hours before filming in his shirtless shots, and he said it made him feel headachy and faint, but he was pleased with the results, as dehydrating tightened everything up and gave him the exaggerated muscle definition and vascularity that he wanted to show in his shirtless scenes. And you can certainly see a difference in the way that Wolverine looks, and I think it's the best that he has ever looked in one of these movies. And the same goes for the claws. I love the redesign of the claws. They were very clunky in some of the first X-Men movies because of the CGI, but this time they had a much straighter design, and there were more cuts and angles, and they reflected light easier. The claws came out lower. I think they were also a little bit smaller. So I think Wolverine, the way that he has looked, the way he is written, I think this is the best that he has ever come across in this movie.
Yeah, and I noticed that too. Like, this is pretty much like the peak of him as Wolverine, because after this he's going to do Days of Futures Past and then Logan and kind of close it out. But this is like his peak. And like, just reading that his diet, like, I can only imagine, like, he had to have been eating so many like vegetables and lettuce and that kind of thing just to keep some hydration. I mean, that's insane. But at the same time, you look at around this time, I think Pain and Gain kind of, I think, was about to come out or came out. But like, seeing that kind of like diet on social media at the time, and like, it's no surprise that something like this will come about, like, especially years after like him already playing this role and even getting more jacked for it. It just kind of shows you the times, and then especially like the diet changes that all these actors are going through lately, especially like Chris Pratt was about to go through something like this too. So just crazy that we went from an era of like openly steroided dudes for action movies, and now it's like the diet has kind of changed with kind of less emphasis on the steroids. But this is kind of ties into the whole, like, the idea of The Rock, like, binge eating on an Instagram kind of thing. So it's pretty funny to see these diets for these actors.
So at one point it was rumored that Darren Aronofsky was going to get a chance to direct this movie, something that happened very similarly with Batman, but after 6 months he moved away, and I think part of the issue was the fact that they were not going to give this movie an R rating, and funny enough, he actually rewrote the screenplay with Christopher McQuarrie. If that name sounds familiar to you, he is kind of the godfather of the Mission Impossible franchise and has a reputation for being one of the best screenwriters that is going in Hollywood today. I would have loved to have seen the version of this movie with Darren Aronofsky at the helm in the director's chair, even though I do really like James Mangold, and especially what he did with Logan. But Darren Aronofsky as the director of a comic book movie with Christopher McQuarrie as a writer, I think this would have been utterly fascinating to see what they could have done.
It would have been even darker. And I actually, looking back, I watched the extended cut because my cut had like a few more F-bombs and a few more graphic shots, but I can kind of see how dark it would have even been, like even more dark than that, even darker than Logan, I think, because Darren Aronofsky can really just like take things to some really crazy places, and we've seen that, especially in Requiem for a Dream, I think, and even Black Swan. So, that, and I remember that tease too, hearing that he could have potentially directed it, and I thought maybe this would have been too much and like too much of a mismatch. Turns out I kind of was right, but hearing James Mangold get the job, I still am a big fan of 3:10 to Yuma, and I like, I don't know if I would die on a hill for that movie, but goddamn, that movie is a great mix of like entertainment and well shot cinematography and that Western kind of feel. So in terms of that, I figured like I know what they were going for, that lone gunman kind of feel, and especially going to Japan, the Ronin kind of feel. I thought maybe this would have been the right fit for James Mangold, and I think in the long term it was right. I think they should have made this movie R right off the bat, but because of that, it kind of took back some of the elements that would made Logan even better. So I'm glad that they kind of had the starting point, but man, if they would have had an R-rated version of this right off the bat, I think Hugh Jackman would still be playing Logan even further after this point, even beyond Logan in 2017.
I don't know about that. Maybe we can have that argument in a couple weeks when we talk about Logan, but there is indeed, as you mentioned, a PG-13 cut and an extended R cut. Of course, the PG-13 one is the one that got put in theaters, but it is definitely the most violent X-Men movie that has ever been put to screen. There's a lot of scenes of Wolverine stabbing people, but there's no blood, so they get to keep the PG-13 rating. And we do get one big F-bomb from Wolverine as he tells someone to go fuck yourself at one point, which is exactly what he did in X-Men First Class. But this is definitely a much different portrayal of Wolverine from even Origins and the previous X-Men trilogy. And you mentioned the unrated cut, which I have not seen, but I do like the fact that they are definitely going in a much harder direction, and so much of the focus is on Wolverine separating himself from the X-Men. This is a world where the last stand has happened, and he has indeed killed Jean Grey, and so much of the theme of this movie is Wolverine not being able to die. And he has this healing factor that, of course, prevents that. And he realizes that everybody he loves is going to die, and that his whole life is full of pain. So he escapes. He is not associated with the X-Men at this point, and he just wants to kind of get away from everything. And we see him in the woods. He has a beard. He tries to defend the honor of a bear, and that's kind of when the full plot gets going. And as we kind of transition into talking about the heroes, really Wolverine is it. There is a lot of Yukio and Mariko, but this movie heavily hinges on Hugh Jackman, and I think Hugh Jackman is excellent in this movie. I think this is his best performance up to this point, playing Wolverine. I think he can be very good. I think there are certainly examples of that. The first X-Men, X-Men 2. And then there are honestly times where I don't think he's very good. X-Men Origins Wolverine, as well as X-Men The Last Stand. But here, he's very consistent with the action, with the dialogue, with what he is able to do. The premise of this movie, I think, is very good. And it gives Hugh Jackman a lot to work with. While I love Wolverine, I also love Yukio as well. Yukio, they have tremendous friendly chemistry. I think that's the best way I could put it. And I really wish that this movie had been those two either going on adventures or them having the relationship, because Yukio, right away, we see how much of a badass that she is with the sword. We see how much of a badass she is with her mutant powers, in talking about when people are going to die, and the fact that she is regarded as Wolverine's bodyguard. When Wolverine loses his powers, Yukio serves as his bodyguard, and I think the scenes between them are so good. And then the minute that Mariko comes on screen, it just goes away. They don't have any chemistry. I think the fact that Mariko is the daughter or the granddaughter of Yoshida is really creepy. They don't have a lot of chemistry, just like I don't think Hugh Jackman and Famke Jensen had a lot of chemistry. And I think their scenes are where this movie just grind to a halt. All the scenes between the train scene and the third act, which you don't think is very good, it's a real struggle. And when people talk about this movie being boring, those are the scenes that are just that. So there are really only 3 heroes to evaluate. Wolverine is incredible. I think Yukio is very good. Mariko drags this score down for me, so much so that I give this a 7.
This is a strange score for me. I was just so blown away at his performance and the level of physicality, and how much Wolverine gets fucked up in this movie is unbelievable. He gets so physically stabbed more so than any of the X-Men movies previously. I think he really gets it, even more than the Lady Deathstrike thing where he got beat up in that one, in that scene. In this movie, it's just from the start he's getting shot at multiple times. I think he's shot at least 20 times in this movie, even with a shotgun at some point. So the way he carries himself, and I love that chemistry he had with Yukio. Mariko, not as much, but like you said, it kind of got a little bit boring in those scenes, but I kind of get the whole idea of him trying to protect this girl, or the princess idea. Every time he said that, I kept thinking of him as Han Solo. So I thought that was a little interesting kind of, thing that planted in my head. But for me, I'm going to give the hero score a 9, because, man, this really is the Wolverine that we've been waiting for, man. And I didn't realize how awesome he was in this movie until I watched it the second time, because I'm just so used to that, from Logan in 2017, I thought that was oh my God, that's the Wolverine we've been waiting for. But in reality, we got it a little earlier, and I just didn't pick up on it because I wasn't so used to this new style that they were trying to introduce, that James Mangold was introducing, this new, introverted, PTSD Wolverine, I like that a lot, and it kind of carries into Days of Futures Past a little bit, which I like a lot too. So for me, here, from this point on, Hugh Jackman really steps it up as Wolverine and starts, becoming that Wolverine that we really, wanted all these years. And him going berserk on all these guys and all these ninjas and stuff, it's crazy. And to see him, at the beginning of the movie, kind of marking his territory kind of thing, still being the animal, still being this, beast, and sleeping in a cave kind of thing. I just love the concept of him being in the wild, because he is a wild man kind of thing, and all that stuff, and it just really just makes that character memorable to me. So I'm giving it a 9, even though the other characters kind of take it down a little bit. But I just felt like Jackman just really stepped it up and made the Wolverine like the badass that he's supposed to be in this movie.
As far as the villains go, they are lame and generic. We have Yoshida, who was saved by Wolverine, ultimately wanting to live forever. So he does everything in his power. He has a son named Shingen. And as I was DMing Brian recently, Shingen, the actor who plays Shingen, has now been killed by 2 different Ronins. Who is the other Ronin that Shingen gets killed by, Brian?
Well, that'd be Clint. But how do you know that this is not just another alternate universe and it was the same Shingen?
I don't believe that the character's name in Avengers Endgame was Shingen, perhaps?
Oh, come on. Just let's carry out this multiverse thing and then take it way too far and get really crazy with it.
I don't know, man. I don't know. There's also Viper, who has the mutant power of she's basically Poison Ivy. That's the easiest way that I can talk about her. She even looks a lot like Poison Ivy. I think they have some interesting concepts, but there are just way too many damn villains for people to care about. And there's also Naburo, who is barely in this movie, but he is the fiance of Mariko, and he's a pig. That's what he is. We literally see him in a hot tub with women, and he gets thrown off into a pool, which is a really funny moment. But the villains of this are almost irrelevant. So much of the focus is on Wolverine, and depending on who his sidekick is, whether it's Yukio or Mariko. I really like the idea of them going with the Silver Samurai. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's conceptually interesting, but it wasn't well developed, and it looked a lot like a character from a different movie, which we'll address in the Burning Questions. But I just think the villains are really bad, and I think they really take this movie down a lot. And I think when people, again, when they make the argument that this movie is boring, the villains are why, because there is nothing interesting about any of them. I think the performances are pretty generic. I don't think the writing is very good. So I settled on a score of 4 for the villains.
I'm going to go with a 6. I just feel like the concept is there, and the idea that this guy, that got saved by Wolverine at the bombing of Nagasaki, and sees that he's immortal and wants to take his powers from him. That concept was cool, and I just didn't like the idea that they just hit him off until the end, and then we really had no idea who the villain was up until the last 10 minutes, and that's what was really frustrating, because at one point they make it seem like the Sun is the villain, but in reality he really wasn't the villain, and when he could have been helping Wolverine the whole time, the Sun, but he decided to fight him for some reason and fight with Yukio for some reason, and which really made no sense because they were on the same side technically. So I don't even know why they were fighting. And I don't know if it was my cut in particular, but did your cut have subtitles?
It did have subtitles.
Okay, so maybe my version that I watched was off, and that's why I was a little confused too, because my version that I watched online did not have subtitles. So some of the dialogue just kind of went over my head of like, what are they talking about? Who's on whose side? And the other thing about Muriko's like former boyfriend too, like I don't get why he was a bad guy when and essentially he was on the side of the good guys by the end of the movie when he just kind of switched sides. So like the whole idea of who's the villain and who's not, and the big reveal at the end really kind of messed things up. But I do like this idea of the Yakuza and the Yakuza bosses, and I love that kind of thing, and reminds me of some old Yakuza movies I've seen in the past, and kind of reminds me of Kill Bill Volume 1. So that stuff was cool. It's just the idea of like who's the real villain kind of confused me, and that kind of ties in with the messed up third act. So I'm gonna give it a 6, even though like it's a contrast for me because like I give such a high score for the villain because Hugh Jackman was unbelievable, but this is a 6 because of just the lack of clarity of actually who the main villain is.
I thought my score was going to be way higher than yours, and it appears that is going to be the other way around as we transition into talking about the story. Throughout the movie, we get a number of flashbacks involving Wolverine and Jean, as he is still dealing with the fact that he killed her and is still wrestling with that fact. Ultimately, I do have to take points off because this is, again, the story of a white man finding himself in an Asian country. This is a trope that has been done numerous times, even as recently as Iron Fist and Doctor Strange. It's really annoying. I do have to address it, and I do know that this is based off a comic book, but again, this is a trope that just really, really needs to go away. The way that I have the story written is Wolverine is isolated from the X-Men and wants to die. He's not hurting living creatures and defends the honor of a bear. The bar scene with him and the hooligans, so to speak, is really entertaining, even up to the point when Yukio comes in. I think this movie is pretty leisurely paced, and very little is given to the supporting characters, very little incentive to care about them. And the fact that this movie is 2 hours and 6 minutes, that is the theatrical cut, I think hurts it a lot. And I really wish that the length of this movie had been closer to X-Men: The Last Stand, something that is a very tight 1 hour and 45 minutes. We get Viper being portrayed as a threat, but gets very little to do other than being an evil, poisonous woman, which, again, still not great. I think that for me, the biggest part of this movie, and this also connects to the technical score, for me, my favorite scene is the bullet train sequence. That is where Wolverine is fighting off the Yakuza or whomever to defend Mariko's honor. And for this was very complicated technically, as the performers were filmed on wires above a set piece surrounded by green screen. The moving background came from filming on an elevated freeway in Tokyo. The bullet trains in Asia are spectacular, and I can only imagine what being on top of them looks like, but I love the bullet train sequence. I think it is spectacular, and for me it elevates this movie. I really like a lot of the action sequences, even when Wolverine is walking through the town and getting stabbed by all of those various pointy edges, and we see that visual. So I think some of this is obviously aided by the cinematography and the technical aspects of this movie. I think the story with the villains is a little bit weak, but I think there's a lot of strength here, and it sets up Logan in a really good way. So my story score is kind of mixed, but I come out just a little bit positive and say a 6.
Yeah, I'm about right there. I'm gonna go to the 6 as well. I love the first 2/3 and the way it's set up, and like this idea that he's into hiding, he's really depressed, he can't sleep at night, and like even with that scene with him and Mariko, and then like them sleeping in the same bed, and then like him having that nightmare, and then her comforting him. Like I thought that was a nice little touch, because like God knows if he goes to sleep again and has like another nightmare, he could easily stab her in his sleep, right? And that's what I'm kind of like worried about in that scene, and it kind of plays onto that. So I thought that was a nice little touch, and it ties into real PTSD for soldiers that really go through that shit and can't sleep at night, and that's like a real thing, and a real thing that people go through. And I like that idea that they touched on that, and I like the idea of Femke Janssen coming back and kind of haunting his dreams. I like that little touch. Like I said in last week's or a couple weeks ago in The Last Stand, like as much as a tainted legacy that movie has, like that idea that he killed Jean Grey kind of sticks with him throughout the rest of the movies later on, and it kind of affects him here, obviously. So I like that. My problem with the third act is just like everything is great up until the arrows, and then he knocks out, and then he wakes up, and then everything kind of goes off the rails. I thought the big Silver Samurai thing at the end was just too wacky and out of nowhere, and it didn't really fit the theme and the realism of the movie that it was going for. I thought it was just too out of place for me. And then some of the stuff at the end, like I mentioned before, like the son having no reason to fight Wolverine and Yukio, I just thought that was bad. Viper, on the other hand, like she was a real bitch, and she was just so bitchy in this movie that I guess that was on purpose, and it kind of worked where it's just like, you were kind of glad that she died at the end kind of thing. But I mixed feelings, because she wasn't really well developed. She was just really acting really bitchy and had no background at all. So that's where that third act kind of falls apart for me. So I'm giving it a 6. I love the first 2/3, man, but up until the point where he passes out from the arrows is just where it kind of goes off the rails a little bit. And then it kind of gets back on track with Xavier and Magneto in the mid-credits scene, which everyone kind of remembers. Even though they still never explain why Xavier still looks the same, even though he took over someone else's body. We'll get to that at a different point sometime.
Again, we do not need to evaluate the timeline of the X-Men movie, because even the mid-credit scene, if you watch Days of Future Past, it actually doesn't make sense. This scene literally has no place in that universe of the movie. So you just almost have to take it on its own merits and just appreciate it for what it is. And that is definitely a moment where I think people were kind of mixed on the movie, but they were super excited to see what was coming next. Kind of like what happened with Split, where you watch this movie and then at the end it all kind of comes together when you see Bruce Willis sitting at the end of the cafeteria table. But in this case, it was Wolverine going to the airport and then everybody freezes. First you see Magneto and then you see Xavier. And I distinctly remember a large amount of applause when Xavier is just rolling through. And it still got me, even watching it this most recent time, of the music and Xavier just rolling through, and the fact that you know that they're going to be back, and Magneto and Xavier are together, that there is a redemption of even their relationship.
Yeah, and I think that just the failure of X-Men 3 kind of ties into that, and that redemption moment, and that crowd-pleasing moment. And I remember my theater was clapping at that moment too, so that was like a nice little touch. But looking back, I wouldn't be surprised if that was added like late into production, because Yukio's not even in the scene, and she's supposed to be his bodyguard again at the end of the movie, right? But she disappears. So I think that was shoehorned in to kind of fit, because the next year obviously was Days of Futures Past, and like I said before, with the X-Men franchise films, it's like they don't plan things ahead too much and kind of go with it film by film, and that's why the continuity is like so off in each one.
All right, the technical aspects of this movie, I think it generally looks good. I think there's some excellent, well-done looking shots. I think the score is better. I don't think there's anything too memorable, but I think it's at least a solid score. I think there's parts of this movie where things are not happening. And again, I think that the leisurely pace does hurt this a lot. And you probably should not have had, again, this probably should have had The Last Stand's running time. I think the editing could have been much tighter. So I'm going to go with a score of 6, but a lot of that has to do with kind of the editing issues. I think the cinematography is probably among the best of any of the X-Men movies, because I think it's a little bit more distinctive. I don't think it's as tinted blue as some of the other X-Men movies. So I kind of come out mixed on this, but that's where I'm coming down as a 6.
Yeah, I love the beginning, like I said before, with the bomb coming down at Nagasaki, and then, just seeing Wolverine's body take it and the effects of it. That was really shocking to see, and it's very disturbing to see the second time around. But that's just kind of the horrors of war and the realities of what Japan had to go through at that time, and they kind of reflect, and they kind of touched on that because they go back to the well, where they were hiding, and so I like that little touch, and then the way that the scenery looks so much beautiful and brighter in comparison to the beginning where everything was destroyed by the bomb. So I like that nice little touch. That's a little thing I've noticed in some things in the cinematography. I love that scene where, like I mentioned, the arrows of him just being centered, and all the arrows are just like with ropes tied to him, and he's just looking down, and he just falls to his knees. That's a great visual. There's a lot of great visuals in this movie that kind of carry over to Logan. And that's what I love about, the connection I'm seeing between the two movies now. So I'm giving it an 8. I think the visuals are great. I like the little hints of the soundtrack, because I can tell, some of the soundtrack elements sound very similar to 310 to Yuma, that Western kind of sound. So I like that the little things that they did there, and then kind of carry over some of those similar themes that they used here into Logan. So I like that aspect, and then using that kind of samurai, soundtrack kind of sound as well. I love what they did there. So I love the visuals and the sound of this movie. Editing, that's the problem. Even the version I watched was 2 hours and 18 minutes, so even longer than yours. So I couldn't tell what was, on the cutting room floor, because I hadn't seen this movie in forever. But it did feel like even the 2 hours and 18 minutes could have been easily shaven down to like an hour and 50, even with the extended cut. Because the extended cut was really just more blood and a couple more F-bombs. So
the legacy of this movie is very complicated, because I think people remember the post-credits sequence and what it set up. But I think this movie does a tremendous job of setting up Logan. I really like some of the action sequences. I think James Mangold was the right choice for this movie and ultimately Logan. I had a really hard time coming up with a legacy score. I'm going to go with the 7, because I think this movie is much better than people give it credit for, because I think people really like to crap on the X-Men movies at this point. And certainly we have done and will do our fair share again of that. But I think this movie is actually good, and I think it's the perfect setup for Logan, and for all those reasons, I'm giving this a 7.
I'm going to go with a 7 as well. That's what I was feeling right off the bat. And for me, the legacy initially is that mid-credits scene to set up Days of Futures Past. But then if you just leave it at that, it would have been, a lower legacy score. But because Logan came out in 2017, and now you look back and see all the connections between the two that we're noticing now, like I said, through that lens of Logan, it really makes it more effective. And I really think this is an underrated movie. Like looking back now, like my score is going to be much higher than yours. Looking at the math right now, but man, with that 7, my final score combined is a 36, and I didn't expect it to be that high.
Mine is a 30, which is 6 points lower, but I still think it is much higher than a lot of people would give this credit for. And I think this movie is just very, very solid throughout. And I certainly think there are some significant flaws, but I think if you make a couple of key changes, I think this movie absolutely could be in our superhero pantheon. And I'm sure the people listening to this probably would not expect that, but I think this movie is definitely worth a rewatch, and go in with the understanding that it is certainly not perfect, but I certainly think it is better than people give it credit for.
Absolutely, me too. And that's a credit to James Mangold, I think. Like, he really understands the character well, and he really understands that that animalistic, need of like killing and then him wanting to die. It just really that fits the whole idea of the Wolverine character, of this character that's been living for so long. He even says, like, at one point in the movie, I don't know if this was in your cut, but so many fucking wars. He says that. And it's just like he's like torn and just tired from it, and that's the vibe that you get. And that's exactly what the Wolverine should be at this point in his life, and he got that to a T.
All right, with all that in mind, let's get to the burning questions. Brian, I'm going to change the order a little bit here, so work with me on this. Did you wonder what the Super Shredder was doing in this movie after seeing Silver Samurai?
Yeah, I got that vibe too. It was just a giant version of Shredder, and I look back at some of the Silver Samurai original like artwork, and I kind of get what they were going for, but it just came out so goofy because it was so big and enlarged, like it didn't fit the mood of the movie. That's why it kind of threw me back a little bit. But yeah, Shredder definitely made an appearance in this movie, it felt like.
Absolutely. How much better would this movie have been if the focus was on Wolverine and Yukio instead of Wolverine and Mariko?
Well, we would have had that Logan vibe, right? Because that was more focused, and that I was getting a little bit of that vibe, even though Yukio is like a 20-year-old something woman in this movie. I love that dynamic, and it sucks that she never got to come back and reprise this role, because there's something to that. And I don't know if you could have brought her back in Logan or whatnot, but that would have ruined probably the dynamic of Logan. But I mean, it sucks that she got not necessarily wasted in this, but like she had such a better performance than most of the X-Men actors that have had more than 3 movies, right? She's certainly better than Storm, Jean Grey, a lot, even Kitty Pryde, even Rogue, I think, and just because of her performance. So it sucks that she didn't get to do more.
All right, Brian, we have reviewed all of the superhero movies of 2013, so we are going to play a very difficult game. Rank them: The Wolverine, Man of Steel, Iron Man 3, and Thor: The Dark World.
Okay, so I'll go with Man of Steel 1, because I still have a weird, not love, but a like of that movie for some reason that frustrates people. Number 2, I'll go Wolverine. 3, Iron Man 3, and then 4, Thor: The Dark World.
I really want to put Iron Man 3 last, but that would be inaccurate. Of course, Iron Man 3 is in our pantheon because we lost a bet. I hate that movie with a fiery passion, but it is still better than Thor: The Dark World, despite what happened in Endgame. So 4 is Thor, 3 is Iron Man 3, 2 is Man of Steel. It says a lot that despite my hatred of Man of Steel and Zack Snyder in general, that it is still better than Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World. And my number 1 is The Wolverine. I think this movie is significantly better, like I've said, than a lot of other movies. 2013 really was just a bad year for superhero movies, and that's unfortunate because, we had Wolverine, Iron Man, and Superman in one year, and they were all major disappointments, I would say.
I guess the Avengers kind of just had that lasting effect from 2012 that it was so hard to top that one that it took a while to get back on that track.
Clearly. All right, our next question. Where does the train sequence rank among action sequences in superhero movies?
That's tough for me because, I don't know, it's maybe top 15. It's very well done. And the idea that, you have to stick your claws in and then hold tight, and then the other guy has to hold his knife down to hold tight. Very well thought out concept. But like I said, because I hadn't seen this movie in so long, I didn't even remember that sequence until I saw it the second time around. So it's hard to say where it ranks. But I don't know. I think maybe some of the stuff at X-Men 2 kind of sticks out a little bit more for me. The opening with the president and what's his name? Forget his Nightcrawler. Like, I think that probably sticks out more for me. But we'll see. I know this probably means a lot more to you, but I'll say top 15 right now. It's just kind of hard to put those sequences together in my head with all the superhero movies that kind of rank.
I think it certainly ranks up there with the top 5 to 10, and I think this is almost better than anything that I've seen in the MCU as far as kind of a middle of the movie sequence. It's not going to top what we saw in Infinity War and Endgame in a lot of ways, but I think the sequence is very underrated, and there's a lot of style to it, there's a lot of danger to it, and I just think it's very well executed in a movie that I think, from a cinematography standpoint, is executed very well. I think this is a great example of it. All right, the fifth question. I've been doing this for just about all of the X-Men movies. I'm going to do it again here. On a scale of 1 to 10, how excited were you for another X-Men movie, especially after the post-credits sequence?
I would say a 9 because reading the plot right after I saw that movie of how they were going to combine First Class and this one, because it was still kind of weird because First Class comes out in 2011, this comes out in 2013, and First Class seemed like a whole like kind of reboot of the franchise itself, right? But then this movie comes out and references all the events from the first trilogy, and then you read the plot line and it's like, oh my god, they're going to do Days of Future Past just like the show and the comic. And then you got to put it all together and you read the cast list and it's like, holy shit, they're combining both casts. So for me, it was like about a 9 because I was like, they're getting ambitious, they're doing something crazy. This is something the MCU would kind of go for, and then of course they would probably do it. I mean, the MCU would do it like this year, but they were kind of ambitious enough to do it first and kind of reset that timeline. So
Yeah, I would say a 10, 9 or a 10. It certainly had me much more hyped up for the X-Men, and I was kind of on an X-Men high at this point. I really liked First Class. I really liked this movie even at the time. So I was really fired up for Days of a Future Past after basically being done with this franchise. They slowly brought me back in, and that post-credit sequence was certainly something that made me excited for the future of this franchise. And indeed, that is the movie that we are going to be reviewing next week. It is going to be quite the conversation as we are going to be discussing the theatrical cut of Days of a Future Past. There is a cut that is about 15 minutes longer. It is called the Road Cut. We are not going to review that one. Maybe we will at some point, but next week we are going to review the non-Rogue cut of X-Men Days of Future Past.
funny too, like because of the new movie coming out. All these movies are on FX right now, so it's easy to kind of just sit back and watch these in the kitchen and kind of. It's funny the timing of everything. You know what I mean? It's like I'm in the kitchen last night. I'm about to watch Wolverine. All of a sudden, Days of Future Past is on. So there you go.
Yes, as we are slowly coming to the end, and we will be getting to Dark Phoenix, of course, and Logan as well. But next week is Days of Future Past, and it will be very interesting to see where that falls into our rankings. For Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to our review of the Wolverine. We will talk to you again next week for Days of a Future Past.
I can't believe that guy fell in the pool and Wolverine didn't even know it was there. That's so funny.